It's probably of no surprise to you that you've heard things about dinosaurs still existing. Missionaries who have traveled deep into the Amazon rainforest have seen things that many forgotten tribes have seen. Real-life breathing sauropods. Although extremely rare, these are not the only large reptilian sightings to come to surface. While the details to these particular sightings might be as elusive as the dinosaurs themselves, there have also been creatures spotted in the Arizona deserts, identified by what many would consider to be a velociraptor of some kind. Not the Jurassic Park renditions though. These are much more bird-like. While there is at least some evidence that points to these things existing still, the real purpose of this message is to relay to you the several encounters that happened near Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. Now, Guantanamo Bay already has a pretty bad reputation, but for much other reasons like violence and tyranny, and not so much dinosaur sightings like you would imagine. Over the years, there has been several witnesses, from locals who live on the islands to US Marines, to have all reported seeing the same pterosaur kind of being. Some of these accounts stretch all the way back to 1965 and before then. However, due to technology increasing, and the more frequent traveling between the US and Cuba, there have been far more sightings, many undocumented by the public. One pair of US soldiers who prefer to remain anonymous, both whom are still serving the Navy to this day, back in 1984, around Papua New Guinea, said they spotted this pterosaur-like creature. However, they wouldn't give their account until much later, in 2009. Both of them actually stated that the pterodactyls portrayed in the Jurassic Park films were actually not too far off from their depictions. While the skin tone, coloring, and leather texture of skin was the same, these creatures did look a little bit different. Roughly as tall as a man, but with a bill filled with tiny sharp teeth, which can be expected from a predatory ocean bird like this. It shouldn't come off as too much of a surprise for something like this to continue surviving in such a desolate, forgotten area like Papua New Guinea and many parts of Cuba where man does not venture. Even with modern technology, they do a good job at hiding and staying elusive. The good news being is that they don't appear to be hostile or show any form of aggression. I mean, maybe if you came upon their hatchlings, but that's expected with just about any species of animal, whether it be a bird, dinosaur, or a mammal. I wouldn't exactly lump these things in with cryptids and things of the unexplained. This seems like a situation kind of like sturgeon, a creature that just maintained the right living conditions in order to properly survive all these years. Whereas sturgeon are much more known because there's people that actually fish and find them constantly. The bottoms of lakes and rivers are a lot more easier to get a visual of than the tops of New Guinea or deep in the jungles of Cuba, and it might be a situation kind of like endangered species, where there's only a select few of them, or they have a very small population. Again, there are many locals and villagers who have all sorts of oral stories and their own first-hand accounts of seeing these things up in the skies. I have not been able to find anything in a face-to-face encounter with one of these things, but that's because nobody I know has been brave enough to travel to some of the altitudes that these things are probably existing. Maybe existing is the wrong word. Whatever their nests or dens look like, they're probably pretty high up, perched on top of places that man would never be able to reach. Patty Carson and her brother supposedly spotted a real-life pterosaur right outside the Guantanamo military base in 1965. This proves that there are even sightings that predate the 1980 encounters of the two naval marines, and another one by a US Marine by the name of Eskin Kuhn, who saw, reportedly, two large pterodactyls at the same Guantanamo military base. But his sighting was back in 1971. But sightings of supposed pterosaurs don't end there in Cuba and New Guinea. There have been numerous sightings all over the United States, along with what people refer to as thunderbirds, which I firmly believe are two separate animals. Thunderbirds have been described as being a large blackbird or eagle-looking like animal, where, as a dinosaur, there's really no mistaking if you were to see a dinosaur. I feel like pop culture and our society in general has a pretty good idea of what a dinosaur looks like. That would be a hard one to mistake. An encounter was had on Wednesday the 18th in July, back in 2012, where an individual, unknown, was traveling down Highway 27 in Franklin, Georgia with their two sons, around 8:15 in the morning, where they apparently looked up and saw what they described as a flying dinosaur. Many other supposed witnesses are not just storytellers or people with nothing to do. These are legitimate professional individuals, like attorneys in California, college professors, former biology professors, scientists, and even a president of an electronics company. And not only has there been sightings in the United States, but also Australia, New Zealand, Tasmania, and South Africa. There seems to be a general common link between sightings of featherless flying creatures of great size. This pretty much excludes the whole concept of a thunderbird, and really much only leaves flying reptiles, which then points to a dinosaur or pterosaurs. Now, the hard thing is actually acquiring proper sightings, because the whole concept of a pterosaur or pterodactyl is so rare, and it's a creature that we believe to have been long extinct. It's a much more harder thing to grasp than a Bigfoot, or say even something else. Even large sea monsters are more believable. Something in the sky makes it hard to believe, because if there is a witness, well, there's really nowhere to hide. Something flying in the sky that nobody's ever seen is very vulnerable and open to all other sorts of sightings. While many of the eyewitness reports are from adults, there are quite a handful that are actually from children. Children who wouldn't even know what a pterosaur is or how to make up a description of one. So how is it that they can accurately give an exact matching description of one when they've never even heard of what a pterosaur is? It's sightings like that as a skeptic that really make you go back to the drawing board, so to speak. I mean, take something like the coelacanth, which was thought to be extinct for a very long time, until finally discovered again, living in 1938. Remember that all it takes is one living fossil, or in this case specimen. Underwater specimens are a little easier to obtain, considering in the past 100 years, our underwater exploration technology has skyrocketed exponentially. But there's no doubt that one of these days, somebody's going to capture one of these things on footage. With how good cameras are getting, DSLRs, phone cameras, it's bound to happen at some point. The real question is if these things are making themselves known to the public, even if it's in increments. Where are they nesting? It must be somewhere high up, and not the top of a cell phone tower or a telephone pole. The amount of distance these things can travel is unknown. It's even possible that they burrow and create nests into the ground. But again, nobody has a living species to be able to tell. Doing a little bit of digging, I found an anonymous report from a 67-year-old individual who claims to have seen one of these pterosaurs back when they were 12 years old, around the years of 1960 to 1961 in Ontario, Canada. Here is their story.
It was a dull and rainy fall morning. The rain had just stopped, so we kids were forced to go outside during our morning recess. It was cold and wet, and a low-hanging fog hovered about 20 feet above ground. Us guys started a ball game, but quickly gave up because the ball kept disappearing into the overhead fog. So, we decided to quit and just wait for the bell. Suddenly, we heard screams. We looked up the field at the girls, and the ones farthest away from us were pointing into the overhead fog bank and screaming. Then, the girls below them began screaming and pointing into the fog. I was curious, as were all the other boys, so we positioned ourselves under the fog, hoping we would get to see whatever it was they were screaming at. I can still remember me bracing my legs apart so as to not lose my balance as I looked up into a gray cloud. Suddenly, it appeared. An airplane-sized blackbird was silently gliding just at the bottom of the fog bank. It must have been that low, so we could see where it was going by looking at the ground. It appeared to be only 20 feet over my head, and I could see it clear as a bell. The first thing I noticed was obviously its size. I was directly under one wing, and it was much wider than myself, and a group of my buddies put together. I would estimate one wing to be 20 feet in length. Then I noticed a good 3-foot-long pointed beak and a shorter 2-footish bump on the back of its head, which was not pointed as if it was a beak. Usually, when people report anonymous sightings like this, there is very little to gain, so the incentive to cultivate a fictionist story is minimal. While revisiting the idea that these so-called pterosaurs are mainly not hostile or aggressive, there have been reports of so-called large flying creatures killing people on the mainland of Papua New Guinea, in villages around cities, and adult humans even being carried away. Although news like that rarely if ever finds its way over to the Western world, especially dealing with cryptids of that nature. One quick thing I wanted to point out before I ended this email to you, and it almost seems like Quetzalcoatl, a revered flying god illustrated in many of the ancient Aztec and Mayan cultures. Although commonly depicted with feathers, it's very possible that it could have very well been depicted from a pterosaur of some kind, considering back in those days, they lived in total desolate jungles, with high probability of all sorts of other creatures that flew around and lived in that time, back in a time where much of the jungles and surrounding areas were long forgotten about.